The main villains from parts 3 through 8 are good at causing problems with the advantages they have, so their stand powers symbolize what they use to oppose the message of each story and the strength of its main JoJo. In part 3, Dio's on top of the world because of several advantages going for him. If cause and effect matter, being part of the history from 100 years ago that caused the modern day would already make him significant to the universe. But it's thanks to his vampire powers, his youth was preserved and he didn't need to breathe, separating him from the effects of time that limit everyone else. On top of that, reflecting for so long gave him incredible insight, which, when combined with how he could see the echoes and results of the world he'd outlived, and his natural genius and charisma, almost guaranteed him to be stronger than any single person he could encounter in the modern day. Even though Dio had an unfortunate upbringing, he's always been like Versus, where when he's fortunate, he's willing to abuse his circumstances just the same, because he lacks accountability and his misfortune is only an excuse to justify anything he does, no matter how extreme he gets. Given the opportunity, Dio will use his power to oppress others, but you're not limited to controlling the sum of your own power. All you have to do is get one person weaker than you to pledge their loyalty in return for their life, and then you can have them put a framework in place that cements your power over them. In doing so, their strength is added to yours, and you're freed up to take over the next person. So once Dio escaped from the ocean, his value made someone similarly self-centered, Enya, offer to be his right hand, starting the army of stand users he would build to stretch his power that's marginally over each individual into one that rules above all of them. The world symbolizes the ultimate agency given to Dio, from breaking free from the limits of time and becoming the top stand user. He might not have Jotaro's optimal approach to problem solving, but he has the high ground and can coast on the strengths he does. Part 3 is about making the most of your agency. It introduces stands, and the main character has to apply himself in the most optimal way to stretch as much effectiveness as he can out of himself so he can succeed under a tight deadline. So the main villain is a guy whose power comes from the more time he's given. Even though Jotaro's mental stats are higher, Dio's external advantages make his stand stronger. With his position, his range is much farther, and as a vampire, he can attack without having to worry about damage or stamina, overpowering Star Platinum and allowing him to time stop limitlessly for the longer he practices. But Jotaro makes the most of the inner traits he has, which is why he's able to stretch himself into Dio's time stop and hold on despite having disadvantage for most of the fight. His wit and room for growth are better than Dio's, so it's a matter of survival until he's able to advance in growth and corner Dio, allowing him to earn time stop for himself. Jotaro's effort is so solid, he pulls a berserk, taking a fated rule like how Dio is always supposed to challenge the Joestars, and pushing back so hard, he annihilates Dio anyway, forcing the universe to rely on a roundabout interpretation, so that now on, it's Dio's consequences that have to give the Joestars trials. In part 4, a major theme is society. That's why it takes place in a town of stand users, and most of the villains are designed after ordinary types of people who are just using their powers selfishly. Everyone has some traits or preferences that might not be sustainable, so it's on them to suppress what's harmful and do what they can to make society as livable for everyone. Josuke, the main JoJo, is a guy who specifically has outbursts he loses control during, so his power comes from how he makes the effort to cause good with them and avoid doing wrong. Kira is the opposite, with urges he can control but chooses not to, and unlike the lesser villains, whose selfishness with their powers causes their desires to get out of hand, Kira's desire is fundamentally incompatible with society, since murdering people completely destroys them no matter what. Unlike Josuke, who transforms his society for the better, Kira wants to preserve his status quo, so he also kills to stay secret, while forcing society to stay around him in danger so he can live in his comfort zone. He's like an invisible landmine that anyone could be destroyed by stumbling into, and in the case he spots a target, he'll go out of his way to make sure they're destroyed, annihilating anyone else in his path. Kira solves his problems by completely erasing people. Unlike an automatic stand user, he's manually involved in solving his problems despite following procedures. Because on the one hand, he's willfully impulsive, but on the other, he's meticulous to keep getting away with it. So he's a balance between two states, and he gets one bomb for each hand. His right symbolizes the routine status quo he has freedom to move within, so it's the manual landmine power. And his left symbolizes his impulsive proactiveness he acts on through meticulous rituals. It's the automatic blue shell. One trend for the main villains of JoJo parts is that they also embody a bad response to the villain of the previous part. Anyone in society is at risk from bad apples like Kira, but Diavolo organizes an ecosystem for crime that restricts the rest of society so he alone can be safe from those dangers. And in in doing so, the world he's trapped gets worse, because it has no room to grow and digs back into itself instead. Part 5 is about a guy who, when in power, can support the thriving and growth of any person or society under him. Giorno fights back against all odds because you always miss the shots you don't take. So Diavolo oppresses the rest of the world and gives them worse odds so he doesn't have to take shots. He isolates himself so he never has to feel exposed and at the mercy of others. King Crimson's power comes from how Diavolo traps everyone else in a system so he can be free and never vulnerable like a normal person. As a result, other people can't tell the actual causes behind the effects that impact them, and by hoarding that perspective and agency, Diavolo can take advantage of that framework he traps everyone else within. So the power he's given is to look at a predetermined future and then skip to it. The predetermined future is like the restrictions he imposes, and being the sole person they're meant to provide freedom for, his position on top lets him know the inner workings of his system and provide that information to his underlings. That's why he can use the fact that, by looking at details of a guaranteed future, he's limiting futures to ones that happen despite someone seeing those details, so he can spend those 10 seconds of time he's given in advance to set up a scenario where the most likely context for those details is in his favor. But the system itself is artificial, that he's supposed to be an exception to, since the whole point is that it's in place to isolate him from the rest of the world. He's so isolated that he backseats his own body, only popping out by visibly splitting Doppio's eyes around his own. So by using his active power to skip time, he exerts more influence through the divide in agency caused by his system, and people lose awareness of the causes behind their circumstances, while Diavolo can free himself of the obligations of his predetermined future completely. While Jolene unravels herself, Pucci is in denial and covers himself up, despite relying just as much on his inner character to solve problems. So, he dissociates from Whitesnake and has a power to cover things in illusions by blowing smoke. Pucci wants to save humanity from invisible systems that completely undermine effort, because human hardship, security, and values are all worthless if a single invisible force is able to have its way in the shadows and mess over anyone's life whenever it pleases, like if you find out all your struggling has been in a dream. However, Pucci does this by accepting and working through these systems, not realizing the contradiction thanks to his denial. Pucci himself is pushy and controlling, so in cases that weren't even necessary, he acted as that type of invisible force himself and ended up destroying the people whose lives he forcibly involved himself in, refusing to take the time to respect or critically evaluate those other people's perspectives first. Whitesnake breaks down a person until their sources of agency can be extracted and forcibly preserved. Then they're discs because to Pucci, people are devices that permanent information and programs can be extracted from or inserted into. And the consequence of him messing with other people's agencies while breaking down his own through denial is that they have permanent etchings or scars, making them easier to always take out again unless they have time to settle, which is why he preserves them through discs that don't go away on their own, like how he clings to and glorifies Dio or the image of his sister. The source of his power is dreams or purgatory, dragging things into an inescapable eternity of nothing but deterioration. Fitting D4C's name, Valentine solves problems by taking the easy way out. He hoards relics that only have the power to steal what he knows is there instead of working to make new treasures. And his source of power is a sole position as a leader above ordinary people, where no matter how much the population grows, there will still only be one role. That's why the premise behind D4C is a singularity. Once Valentine brings universes together, he pulls you through the event horizon until you and the versions of you from other timelines are pulled into each other and destroyed as you reach that singularity point. Being an authority gives Valentine the power to control the divisions of the population, to maintain control and order above them. So he's the one that can make rabbit holes to hop between dimensions. And you can struggle all you want, but if it turns out you're not from the division of the population Valentine is close to, you can't even reach him, and you never actually had a chance. Valentine's power comes from manufacturing inequality, by creating systems of influence above individual people, which is why Lucy has to be sacrificed to maintain Love Train, and why the benefits of his strengths don't scale as the world grows, making him the opposite of Johnny. In the end, Valentine with Love Train is a vessel for higher powers, whereas Tusk Act 4 is a vessel for human agency. So when Johnny uses Act 4, which applies rotation to the outer universe, he can spin the singularity itself, turning it into a rotating black hole to pass across the barriers it uses to separate itself or any points in space. And since every Valentine's power comes from a singularity, they're all doomed consumed when the One is compromised. That brings us to alternate Diego, who's a mirror of Johnny's self-centeredness. If someone creates a position above people, like Valentine, someone else with selfish ambition would have the drive to take it over, so he's Valentine's last resort. But unlike Dio, Diego gets the world for having an optimal way of solving problems like Jotaro. The only difference is that he spends his time proactively suffocating others instead of making sure he's doing the right thing. Diego's way of solving problems, gaming any system he can, like a fully realized Jodio, earned him power over the rest of the world in a universe where he had the opportunity to outlive Valentine, and agency doesn't ultimately revolve around one advanced batch of relics. Lastly, Toru's power comes from being born on top of the world. There were several advantages given to him from the circumstances around his birth, because as a rock human, he was born in society's blind spot and in possession of any number of special tools. He recognizes his blessings just enough to embrace and coast on the mysterious ways they independently function, and he leans on the favoritism from the universe he's received to cement how he's on top of anyone else thanks to birthright. So his power is to channel a natural force of calamity in the universe to act in his favor and prevent anyone from pursuing or stopping him, and that's why he clings to superficial identity traits. Whereas Josuke has no interest in being a Yankee, Toru goes so far as to attach stuffed animals to his shirt, and while Josuke doesn't care about his past memories, Toru wants to accumulate interfaces of what he values, so he wants to process his interests into memories to later on appreciate what they were, because Toru's strength comes from accumulating outer traits to layer on top of himself rather than embracing what comes from within like Josuke does. I don't know how well Akka would fit as the main villain, but if a big focus in the JoJo lands is that people's consequences depend on what they choose to do when granted chances, it's very possible that he and Jodio will take turns as the villain. Or at the very least, it could be a role decided by what somebody does in the moment, rather than what they've always been.